My name is Andrew Duncan, and I'm a graduate student at the University of California at Irvine. I am in the Department of Sociology, and my research is on China and international relations. But today, I am presenting on the European Union as a part of your section on international relations. First of all, what is the European Union? Since the end of the Second World War, European nations have increasingly integrated, and this presentation is going to be centered around those different forms of integration, primarily political integration, economic integration, and social integration. We should care about the European Union because it is a unique and historic change in world and regional politics. It is something that hasn't happened before and potentially could be a sign of future advances in politics in other parts of the world, possibly even getting to global governance at some point in the future. The EU is currently the largest economy in the world, comprised of 27 different countries. These countries together make the European Union the largest producer and the largest exporter of goods and the largest importer of goods. Even more importantly, the European Union is still growing. It is accepting candidates, although it is occasionally a lengthy process, but as it is already the largest economy, it will continue to grow and become an even more important part of global politics. So, naturally, what happens in the European Union affects your life because our economies and politics are integrated globally. To provide some context for you, the European Union has a population of over 500 million people in an area of almost half the size of the United States. I already told you that its economy is the biggest in the world, and again, to provide some context, it is over $1 trillion more than the entire United States economy. And we generally think of ourselves as being pretty economically important, so just think about that as an extra $1 trillion, 16 compared to 15. One of the most impressive things about the European Union is how it was built. The European Union is something that has overcome history, a history of conflict and a history of war over centuries and thousands of years even. So if I ask you, we all know about World War II and we all know about World War I. How many wars happened between Europe? The answer is actually 27 wars of various sizes, including civil wars. So we have the infamous Easter Rising, which I'm sure everyone has heard of. We've have the Russian Civil War, the Finnish Civil War, the Greater Poland Uprising, the Turkish War of Independence, all kinds of wars. So even just in the last century, we have many, many wars representing many different groups and conflicts in this region. England and France alone have fought with each other easily for over 1,000 years. Overcoming this conflict could not have been easy. And you see this, it didn't happen overnight either. The European Union was created since the end of World War II through a series of increasingly larger and more integrated treaties that brought the countries together. So why would these countries choose to do that? And you have to remember, again, it's in the context of World War II, where these countries, many of them were decimated, were destroyed, had their economies ruined, millions of people killed. So they would create the EU probably as a form of collaboration, working together for mutual prosperity. This is a term that you've learned before in your international relations section, so this should be familiar to you. And one of the other options, if countries aren't collaborating, what are they doing? They're competing with each other. So is it possible that the EU represents competition if I just told you that it represents collaboration? Well, actually, yes, competition is an important part of this. It's not important because the European countries are competing with each other, but instead, in a more globalized world, the European Union is positioning itself to compete with other regions of the world, primarily the United States and East Asia, both of whom have kind of kicked Europe out of its place as the former center of the world economy. So the creation of the European Union is an attempt to secure greater global power for its member nations by working together. So it's kind of interesting that it represents both collaboration and competition. So to give you some details on how the European Union is organized, we'll talk about how it's politically integrated. The European Union is similar to a confederation. This is a political system where the central authority is limited and member states have a great deal of autonomy. So remember this term called sovereignty. Sovereignty is the ability to control what happens within a state's borders. So in a federal system like the United States, individual states have less sovereignty. They have given up sovereignty to the central power, the United States government. The European Union, as a confederation instead, the member states retain a great deal of sovereignty. They retain the ability to make most decisions within their borders. However, there are a number of supranational, exceeding the borders of one nation, bodies which provide democratic structure. And this is used to do several purposes, mostly economic in function. Things like negotiating trade agreements, especially with non-member nations, abolishing border checks and increasing the mobility of goods and people and money, unifying environmental and safety regulations. Let me ask you, why do you think that environment is something that is regulated beyond the borders of one country? It's because the environment itself is beyond the borders of one country. So if you think about it, if one country, say for instance Germany, is polluting rivers, do you think any other countries are affected by that? Well, anywhere those rivers go, it's going to affect those other countries. So environment is something that needs to be regulated regionally. And finally, it regulates agriculture. And this is, again, a response to World War II issues where in the aftermath of that, there were serious food shortages in many countries. So the EU as a whole wants to manage agriculture to make sure that they maintain self-sufficiency. So what are these supranational bodies? There are three main elements of the political structure of the European Union: the European Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament. The European Commission acts as the executive branch and is composed of one commissioner from each state. What does the executive branch do? They make the decisions, right? It's like our president. The European Council then operates as the primary legislative body and is composed of heads of state from each member nation. The European Parliament is the second legislative body and has direct elections and proportional representation, and serves to balance the power of the European Council. Between the Council and the Parliament, this should sound fairly familiar to you. What does it remind you of in our own government? The US Congress, of course, which has also two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Other important institutions should also remind you of parts of our own government. The European Court of Justice serves a similar role to our own Supreme Court, and the European Central Bank and the European Investment Bank serve roles similar, but not exactly identical to our own Federal Reserve Bank. One thing that the European Union doesn't offer is military integration. Member nations may cooperate with each other on military affairs, but there is no standing army in the European Union and no direct military oversight. So individual nations maintain control of their own militaries. One possible reason for this is that the European Union doesn't need to have military integration built into it because an institution already exists to offer that. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has existed since the end of World War II and has already unified many European nations, as well as other nations, including the United States, for military defense. So, beyond political integration, we also have economic integration. And this is arguably the most important function that the European Union provides to its member nations. Overall, it is designed to create a free trade area, such as NAFTA, which you may have heard of in prior lectures, but with greater centralized power. So in the European Union, there is access to free transport of goods and capital. There is easy, if not quite free, movement of workers from country to country. There's coordination of economic priorities, including agriculture that I mentioned earlier. And there is really great power to negotiate with non-member countries. Think about it. If Germany is negotiating trade with the United States, it's just one nation to another. But if Germany is negotiating with the backing of the entire European Union with the United States, Then they have one incredibly large economy to another, to be fair, but it's still more powerful. So I want to make you think about what is an example of how economic integration is supposed to benefit people living in the European Union. What happens if a French business person wants to open a new restaurant in Italy, for instance? Well, many things might happen. First of all, because of the European Union's openness, the business person can legally enter Italy and obtain a business license. After they have established their restaurant, they can easily import French goods. Presumably it's a French restaurant. Furthermore, French farmers can respond to this increasing demand for shipping their goods now to Italy by hiring more workers, many of whom might even immigrate from other countries. What other effects might come of this? Well, let's think about this. Maybe the French business person has to hire people, and maybe he hires them locally, but another alternative is that he hires people who are immigrating to Italy now in order to get these jobs. Furthermore, you can expand it to these people who are moving there need places to live. Because they need places to live, somebody's got to build it. Maybe the construction companies building homes and other buildings are another French company or a British or a German company. So you can see that economic integration and free markets are supposed to expand the opportunities and help economies to grow in many ways. The final characteristic I'm going to talk about is social integration. To some extent, there has emerged a European culture which combines elements of each individual culture, but brings them all together into a single identity as European. So how does this European culture come about? First of all, people are connecting to each other more and more in Europe. Government and corporate employees now cross borders regularly. There's increasing travel and small business trade as people take vacations from one country to another much more easily, partly because of transportation is easier, but also because money, the euro, makes it affordable for people to go from relatively poorer nations to relatively richer nations. And finally, there's the creation of transnational organizations. Transnational meaning it exceeds one nation's borders again. So trade unions, scientific and professional organizations, and sports and hobby associations. Think of how the World Cup, as an example, brings fans together across the world, while regional associations also do that within Europe and other parts of the world. One of the major questions that comes up from this is, are these benefits worth forfeiting nations' sovereignty, or some portion of their sovereignty? That's a question that we'll have to discuss throughout the rest of this presentation, and it's an open question that you'll have to decide on your own. When you hear about the European Union in the news today, it's not usually talking about it in necessarily positive terms. Most of what we read about is about the European Union in crisis, with the possibility of failure or the possibility of dissolution and breaking up. First of all, social integration is limited because it is biased towards middle and upper classes. If you think about that list that I gave you on the previous slide, what sort of people were making those connections with people from other countries? It's government officials, corporate employees, and people who can afford to take vacations from one country to another. Well, that's very much the definition of middle and upper classes. Furthermore, blue-collar workers are actually a little limited because the institutions that would give them the opportunity to move from one country to another aren't included in the European Union. Institutions such as military service as a major way for people to join up and move from place to place. Well, militaries, as I said, are still primarily national in scope. Similarly, schools and churches, things like that, these institutions tend to be found mostly within national contexts rather than a pan-European context. Popular culture is another element that is still mostly national rather than transnational and European. Think of shows like American Idol. You can find examples of this in Europe, but they aren't called European Idol. They're still located within nations. So you'll find German Idol or British Idol or something like that instead of European Idol. Finally, and probably most tellingly, in a recent study, only 13% of Europeans polled always considered themselves to have a European identity. Now this means that if I ask this person, who are you? What are you? Their answer is going to be, well, I'm European. 43% of those polled sometimes would say European and sometimes would say that they are still national. So instead of saying European, they're going to say French or German or British. And 44% of those polled said that they never ever thought of themselves as European. This could be a big problem for Europe because in order for many of these institutions to work, including sharing economic resources, sharing political resources, people have to start thinking of each other as part of the same group rather than different groups. And we see this affecting the political integration. So it's limited because of this continued nationalism. So as long as countries still think of themselves differently, they're not going to want to give up that sovereignty, even if it would benefit everybody as a whole. And finally, economic integration is also limited because of this continued nationalism, because people don't want to lose jobs to workers from other countries. They don't want to pay for the social benefits of other countries, especially poorer countries. And we see this frequently in debates in the news now about the bailouts of countries that are having a difficult time, including Spain and especially Greece. So one of the issues you'll read about now is that Greece is being told that in order to be bailed out by the European Union economy, they're going to have to change their economy, they're going to have to change their political structure. Greek people aren't taking this very well. They feel like they're being dictated to by other groups of people, primarily the Germans, who are the largest economy, the most powerful economy in the Union. German people, on the other hand, feel like the Greeks aren't fitting in and aren't making things work, and it's creating this tension. It's not political tension only, it's not economic tension only, it's very much a social, cultural tension where Germans are being a little bit ethnocentric against Greeks and Greeks are being ethnocentric against Germans. So you can see how all of these social, economic, and political integrations and the limits thereof are very much related to each other. Furthermore, economic integration has only benefited certain people. What are the good jobs in an economy? So we say the European Union saw a long period of economic growth, but what are the jobs that are being created? They tend to be in high tech, high education, banking, real estate. These are not blue-collar, low-wage jobs, which means that people on the bottom aren't necessarily benefiting as much as they might, and may actually have been harmed by the expansion of the European Union, as now people working for low-wage jobs have to compete with an even larger pool of potential workers. Even worse, economic integration has severely limited the ability of governments to manage their own economies. One of the primary ways that governments deal with slowdowns in the economy or an economy that is too hot, that is growing too quickly, is by controlling access to money. For example, our own Federal Reserve Bank can raise or lower interest rates in order to control access to money. However, in Europe, because there is a central currency, the euro, that is managed by the Central European Bank, individual nations can no longer control the availability of money in their economy. Because of this, when one nation is having difficulties, they have to rely on the entire European Union to help them. So to go back to the example of Greece and Germany, this is exactly the problem they have run into, and this is exactly the source of the fighting. So having talked about all of the potential of the European Union and all of the problems of the European Union, we have to wonder about what is the future. Is this great collaboration something that is sustainable, or is it something that is doomed to fail, and probably sooner rather than later? So will economic conflict continue to lead to more and more cultural and political conflict, which will tear the Union apart? Or will they be able to put their cultural differences and then their political and economic differences aside and stay together and achieve some degree of prosperity? And this is important because if you think about what happens to the rest of the world if the EU is successful or if it fails. If it is successful, it provides another strong economy that helps out many places in the world, including the United States. The European Union is one of our primary trade partners, and we need them to be strong so we can have a strong economy too. Furthermore, it could provide a model for stronger global governance. This is something that might be good for the world in the future, although that's a very debatable topic all on its own. If the European Union fails, we have exactly the opposite reactions. In the short term, it can worsen the global economic recession. Our economy, if it's dependent upon them, if the European Union's economy is failing, then our economy is going to be severely impacted by that as well. And in the long term, it could be viewed as a failed experiment in regional governance, which might actually make it more difficult to move to global governance or regional governance in other areas. So I'll leave you with these final questions from throughout the presentation. Is the promise of the European Union worth all of the member countries giving up some of their sovereignty? Is this European collaboration sustainable? And where do you think that will be in the next 50 years? Thank you.